You are listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 2nd of October 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's program, Iran launches a missile strike while Israel encroaches further into Lebanese territory. We'll get an update on the ground invasion and Hezbollah's possible response. After that,
this was a threat to our democracy in a way that we had not seen. And it manifested itself because of Donald Trump's inability to say. He is still saying he didn't lose the election.
U.S. vice presidential candidates Tim Walz and JD Vance could be the last ones to debate before the November 5th election. Did they move the needle? We'll also get an update on the impact of Hurricane Helene, and we look at the future of Japanese anime with Monocle's Gunnar Grunlund. Gunnar.
Thanks, Chris. We'll be talking about how the future of the Japanese anime industry, very much like Japan itself, is still stuck in the past, and what Sony plans to do about it.
Looking forward to that, Gunnar. And finally, in breaking fashion news, Hedi Slimane is leaving Celine. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. Iran's missile attack on Israel yesterday risks opening a third front in Israel's nearly one-year war, turning the wars in Gaza and Lebanon into a full-on Middle East conflict. For Iran, the missile attack was a response to the killings of the leader of Hamas during a visit to Tehran, as well as the assassination of Iran-backed Hezbollah's leader in Beirut on Friday. All the while, Israel has launched an invasion of southern Lebanon, and the question of whether Hezbollah will step up its own attacks on Israel now looms large. To tell us more, I'm joined now from Beirut by David Wood, senior analyst for Lebanon at the International Crisis Group. David, there is a lot to unpack here, and we'll focus to some degree on Lebanon specifically for this. What's been happening over there over the last 24 hours? What's the state of the ground invasion?
So I think we have some basic facts now. Obviously, Israel announced earlier in the week that it was planning limited incursions to take out targeted Hezbollah infrastructure. What we've understood so far from the Lebanese army is that there has been at least one infiltration attempt, that Israeli soldiers approached within 400 meters of Lebanese territory before being repelled. Now, Hezbollah claims that more than once it has repelled Israeli soldiers from entering Lebanese territory, and claims that it has killed 2 Israeli soldiers and wounded another 18. So we don't have, obviously, confirmation from the Israeli side just yet about whether or not that is accurate, but it does seem as though the ground invasion, or the ground operation, should I say, by Israel in Lebanon are underway.
And can you explain a little bit more what is happening there on the Lebanese side? Because as you say, you have information from the Lebanese army and from Hezbollah. Is the Lebanese army involved in some way, or is this entirely Hezbollah that is trying to fend off these incursions?
So I understand that Hezbollah alone is responsible for leading the repelling of any Israeli soldiers that are entering into Lebanese territory, and the Lebanese army would not be directly involved in these clashes, but obviously the Lebanese army is present as well in southern Lebanon, and at least can continue to perform a sort of observer role, at least for the minute. And this is a real risk, of course, already. If these reports are confirmed, this sums up the real risk of Israel in launching ground incursions, or even a more fulsome ground invasion in Lebanon. And that is that while Israel has demonstrated in the past months, and especially the past couple of weeks, its superiority in the air, and also its pervasive intelligence networks, which have clearly infiltrated Hezbollah, this kind of ground warfare much more suits an organization like Hezbollah, you would think, given its history as an insurgency guerrilla warfare actor, that it might be, with its superior knowledge of southern Lebanon, its knowledge of its own networks of tunnels there, that Hezbollah would be better positioned to fight this kind of conflict and potentially to inflict serious casualties and losses for the Israeli army.
And David, I mean, to that point, we've spoken a lot over the last few days or weeks really about Hezbollah being on the back foot and weakened by Israel's attacks, as he mentioned there, the ones from the air, also, of course, the killing of its leader, Nasrallah. Do you get the sense then that this might shift in some way as a ground invasion occurs? And what kind of response might we expect from Hezbollah to this ground invasion? Are they going to stay, I guess the question is, in a defensive mode, or could they then launch their own retaliatory strikes into Israel as well?
So I think there's a couple of things that we really need to clarify about a potential ground invasion. Number one is that unlike in 2006, the last time that Israel mounted ground operations in Lebanon, Israel fought that war. The decisions were taken for that war and the preparations were made very hastily. This time, it's very clear that Israel has pervasive intelligence networks inside Lebanon and specifically inside Hezbollah, and clearly has a more developed strategy for how it would mount these kinds of ground operations. That's one thing to consider. On the other hand, we don't know exactly how much Hezbollah's military capacity has been degraded, but even after the killing of Nasrallah, it has managed to continue firing missiles and rockets into northern Israel. We also know that Hezbollah clearly has groups of fighters who are still stationed in the south, who have complete knowledge of the tunnel network there, and also understand the terrain and the topography of southern Lebanon, which gives them an edge in this kind of insurgency guerrilla warfare. So a couple of days ago, the acting Secretary General of Hezbollah, Naim Asim, stressed that not only would Hezbollah continue to attack Israel until there's a ceasefire in Gaza, but also that Hezbollah stood prepared to repel any ground invasion mounted by Israel in southern Lebanon. So this kind of warfare is only beginning, and really Israel faces a choice here. It can either take its significant military achievements against Hezbollah now and try to convert them into a diplomatic solution and a new border security arrangement between Israel and Lebanon, or it can press ahead with this ground invasion, which comes with enormous risks and also has the looming danger of mission creep, where Israel could find itself not fighting a limited ground invasion, but also one that could bog it down potentially for months or years.
David, just finally, we did speak at length about Iran's attack on Israel on The Globalist this morning, but I did want to ask you from your perspective in Beirut, how is that being seen there? What kind of impact does it have on Lebanon as this incursion into southern Lebanon is continuing? Israel is potentially opening another front in this war.
Exactly. So last night, when news of the attacks was being broadcast from Tel Aviv into Lebanon, there was lots of jubilation, particularly you would expect from supporters of Hezbollah, who felt that Iran, who some had started to question in Lebanon whether Iran would actually come to the defense of Hezbollah, those attacks and placing Israel on the back foot, even momentarily, was something that was really well received here, and you would expect, particularly amongst Hezbollah supporters. But in terms of whether it will impact the future of the conflict in Lebanon, now obviously, if Israel and Iran enter into a large-scale direct confrontation, you would think that that would potentially divert some attention or some of Israel's attention away from Lebanon. On the other hand, it seems as though Israel's political and military leaders see Hezbollah's stunning weakening and degradation over the past weeks and months as a unique opportunity to press home that advantage. So I would expect that Israel will keep up its military operations in Lebanon, even though, as I just mentioned, it would be a much more prudent path at this point to really use those gains now to push for a new diplomatic arrangement to return stability to Lebanon and to Israel as well.
Thanks very much, David, for unpacking all of that. That was David Wood, Senior Analyst for Lebanon at the International Crisis Group. Now here's Anita Riota with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. Russian forces have reportedly taken control of Vuhledar, a town in eastern Ukraine that had resisted a barrage of Russian attacks since the beginning of the war. The seizure of the coal mining town has given Russian troops strategic high ground and issued a blow to Ukrainian morale after a unit famous for its resistance was forced to abandon it. President Joe Biden's administration has sided with striking port workers, leaning on their employers to raise their labor offer. The ongoing strike has impacted half the U.S.'s ocean shipping, with analysts warning it will cost the economy billions of dollars a day. Taiwan braces for Typhoon Krathon. Torrential rain has shut down the city, with hundreds of flights grounded, and schools, offices, and financial markets have been shut. One person has been reported dead, and officials have warned residents of a potential repeat of a 1977 typhoon that devastated the city. Those are our headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks, Anita. Last night saw the third and potentially final debate of this U.S. presidential election cycle, this one between the vice presidential candidates JD Vance and Tim Walz. Now, we could spend hours parsing just how much of an impact the vice presidential candidates actually have on a presidential election, but whatever the truth is, it does tell us something about the presidents. After all, their choice of VP is the first and most important choice of their campaigns. Well, Simon Marks, Washington reporter, joins me now to dissect the debate and its likely impact on the race. Simon, both candidates in this debate last night were confident, cordial. I do wonder if there will be some people wishing the tickets were reversed.
Well, I think that's perfectly possible, Chris. I mean, it was like stepping back in time, wasn't it? To a moment when presidential and vice presidential debates were always cordial and respectful. Both men seemed to hold each other in some degree of esteem. There was a lot of commonality in many of the answers that they gave, something that Tim Walz noted at the end of the debate. I mean, in terms of the reaction to it, one instant poll from Politico found that, to no one's surprise, Democrats thought that Tim Walz had won it, Republicans thought that JD Vance had won it, and the last remaining independent voters out there whose support is up for grabs as we hurtle into this final month of the election campaign, in large measure did not bother to stay up to watch the event. So hard to see that they will have been influenced particularly by it, certainly as far as the live transmission was concerned. I think JD Vance was steadier on his feet than Tim Walz. There's no question about that. Tim Walz had a couple of moments in the debate, certainly at the beginning, and then later on when he was asked to justify some claims he'd made about being in Hong Kong on the day that the Tiananmen Square uprising was put down by the Chinese. It turns out that he wasn't in Hong Kong on that day at all. He was pretty uneasy in terms of answering that question, but equally JD Vance had difficulties answering a very simple question about whether Donald Trump lost the last presidential election or not. But I think it will mostly be remembered for the respect and the decorum that existed mostly during the debate between these two men.
It is striking what you said in there about independents probably not staying up to even watch this. I guess that answers the question about how important these vice presidential debates are. But one aspect that I did want to ask you as well is the policy side, because arguably there too, there is more policy than the Trump-Harris debate. And that does say something about how these next administrations would govern.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, JD Vance came out as being a far more vigorous and effective defender of Donald Trump's time in office, certainly with regard to the economy, than Donald Trump had proved to be during his two debates, one, of course, with Joe Biden and then the other with Kamala Harris. We do not think we will see another debate before Election Day. JD Vance absolutely focusing on assuring people that Donald Trump's handling of the economy had been strong. He said that rising prices that the country has witnessed under the Biden-Harris administration, and JD Vance barely mentioned Biden. He was tying Kamala Harris to all of this. He said, I know what it's like not to be able to afford the things you need to afford. And with regard to Kamala Harris's record, he said that when Tim Walz was talking about what day one of a Harris administration would look like, well, JD Vance, with one of his more effective lines of the night, was day one was 1,400 days ago, and her policies have made America's problems worse. Tim Walz, by contrast, found language, particularly on abortion rights, really to go after Donald Trump and JD Vance as well, saying that it's not fair that after the Supreme Court struck down Roe versus Wade that had kept abortion legal across the country for half a century, it's not fair that your freedom now depends on where you live, a reflection of the fact that individuals individual states now get to make their own laws on abortion. It was also notable that Tim Walz really went after JD Vance over the issue of January the 6th and his seeming inability to answer the simple question, did Donald Trump win in 2020, as Mr. Vance completely evaded the question. Governor Walz said that is a damning non-answer, and he challenged JD Vance to say whether he would keep his oath of office even if his president in the future did not.
Simon, with all of that said then, I do wonder if there is still any expectation that there will be another debate before November 5th between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Is that still a possibility? And would there be people that still want to see that, still have questions unanswered?
Well, I think anything's possible, and you never say never. Kamala Harris keeps insisting she's ready for another one, and Donald Trump so far is publicly evincing no interest in one, although when he says he doesn't want to do one, he always goes on to say, of course, I'd really like to do it, but it's too late because the election is already underway, which is a reference on his part to the fact that early voting has begun in several states, although there have been presidential debates in the past much closer to election day, so there's no rule in the book that says you can't do it. I think voters, we know that this race is deadlocked, or certainly appears to be from the polls. Many voters are very clear that they still want to know more about Kamala Harris and her precise policy plans if she wins the White House. And that's one of the reasons why I think she may be keen to do another debate with Donald Trump. At the moment, there's no indication it's going to come, but maybe, Chris, that's going to be the October surprise.
Simon Marks, thank you very much. Washington reporter there. Thank you. You are listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Now, sticking with the United States, more than 150 people have died as a result of the devastation Hurricane Helene brought to southeastern states, including dozens of flood-stricken North Carolina. President Joe Biden will visit North Carolina, and Vice President Kamala Harris will travel to Georgia to assess the damage. In Asheville, officials have pledged to get more water, food, and other supplies to flood-stricken areas that had no power or cell service on Monday. To find out the latest situation, Monocle Radio's Tom Webb spoke to Asheville resident and employee of Explore Asheville, Cass Harrington, from the scene.
I am speaking to you from outside Hilton Garden Hotel, where someone has generously set up a Starlink connection. There's several hotspots around town that volunteers have provided their own personal internet for the community use, because currently Wi-Fi and cell service in Asheville is very spotty and unreliable as the city works to stabilize the situation.
And what is the situation currently?
For those who aren't familiar with Asheville, it's a relatively small city. It's about 100,000 people in the mountains. And what I have to say from my time living here is this is something that no one ever anticipated. They're calling it a generational weather event because we live in the mountains, which I personally have taken for granted, thinking this is a haven and a refuge and we are safe here. But as you know, as the global community knows, we're experiencing extreme climate swings and climate catastrophes due to the warming climate. And so currently, because of Hurricane Helene, there are rivers and creeks that run through this town that have flooded. We're experiencing landslides in the mountains that have blocked roads. So some residents are isolated and don't have access to resources. We don't have any running water, no potable water at this time. So people are scrambling to find bottled water or filling stations. But what I can say is, even though it feels very catastrophic and uncertain, I can see the community being so resilient, so generous and kind-hearted. You know, in the neighborhood where I'm staying, I can share more about what happened to me personally, but I'm staying at a friend's house where there's one of the few grocery stores that's still opening. And there was a line several blocks long out the front door. And even though, there's an urgency, people need water, they need food. They can't even cook their food right now because there's no electricity. People in line are talking to each other, supporting each other, and coming together in ways that we really need right now. And it's beautiful to see the human spirit just come together and support, because that's what we have. That's our superpower.
And what is the government doing to support you?
FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Association, is here providing assistance. We know that at least 13 states are providing assistance as well, whether that's sending over police and sheriff departments or rescue operations. And this morning I had a huge smile on my face when I saw pretty much a parade of electricity vehicles with the cherry pickers to fix all the fallen cables and telephone lines. So we're seeing this massive effort from the NGO perspective. The Red Cross is here, which I encourage anyone listening. That's a great organization to support at this time. And also World Central Kitchens. Asheville is known for its restaurant and dining scene, and we're seeing chefs come together and provide meals to the community.
You're talking about the rebuilding effort. How is it going? And are the conditions strong enough to begin?
Well, Tom, right now, even though it's been, 4 or 5 days, we're still stabilizing. I mean, there are people who are unaccounted for still. Death count continues to rise, and people urgently need basic supplies like drinking water. So I think the rebuild effort is really going to happen once we can account for everyone in our community and make sure that we have a streamlined assistance, because right now communications, as you can tell from this call, are very spotty. And so we're getting snippets of information from neighbors, from the radio, from social media. And once that is stabilized and we have a clear sense of what needs to be recovered, I think that's what we're looking for a way forward for our community. I think, obviously the question for those who have been to Asheville or who have wanted to travel to Asheville, people may be wondering, when can I go back? And I think it's definitely too soon to say, but I do know that this community is incredibly creative and resilient and resourceful. And on the other side of this, I know that Ashevilleans and people in the Appalachian region will come out stronger, more close together, more supportive, and more sustainable, because that is our way, and that is the only way.
Tom Webb speaking to Cass Harrington in Asheville there. You're listening to The Briefing. You are back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. I'm Chris Chermak. Now for a look at Japanese anime, an industry that has long captivated the world's attention and been something of a soft power boon for Japan, but it's being created with surprisingly low tech, and Sony is among those now looking to change that. For more, I'm joined by Monocle's researcher, and we're going to call him Animation Desk Chief Gunnar Grunlid. Good afternoon, Gunnar.
Good afternoon.
So let's start with the industry itself. Give us a little bit of context here. How big is the Japanese anime industry? And it is still growing, isn't it?
It is absolutely massive now, and the main point really is just how quickly it's been growing. So in 2022, it reached some 19 billion euros just that year and 3 million yen. And 10 years ago, it was less than half of that. So it's grown extremely rapidly in a very quick period of time. It used to be obviously huge inside Japan, and then it was very niche in the rest of the world. But now it's really gone mainstream, and you're seeing Japanese anime films in the cinema making over $1 billion, which is already sort of unheard of for most mainstream films. That's how big it's gotten.
So that's a sign of how big it is. And what's interesting, I guess, about this story that we want to talk about is these efforts to challenge the low-tech nature of the creation of Japanese anime. And yet, I do feel like I have to ask, watching Japanese anime, isn't low-tech part of the point?
I think low tech isn't necessarily the point, but the point is the hand-drawn aspect of it. I mean, that's what's made anime sort of stand out from Western animation for a long time, because for a long time Western animation has embraced computerized animation. Even whether it's 2D or 3D, they use more computer techniques to make this kind of stuff happen. Anime has had more of a hand-drawn feel because it is actually mostly drawn by hand, every single frame. But the low-tech problem that we're talking about here really is that, so a bunch of sources from inside the industry have been telling Asahi Shimbun, they're still using tablets and tech that were from 20 years ago and software that was from 20 years ago, where the vendors aren't even updating the software anymore and can't provide tech support or anything, but they're just holding on to this stuff. And so Sony is trying to step in because it's really become like the biggest global anime sort of player on the scene. It has a lot of the biggest studios, it has the biggest streaming services for anime, and it's trying to step in to create its own software to streamline a lot of this stuff, because it's really become a bottleneck for an industry that's growing so rapidly, but it can't keep growing at this point because they're basically at capacity because of all these delays and slowdowns that just happen because of technical old problems.
So they're at capacity, if you will, when it comes to the distribution or things like that of anime, rather than the hand-drawn aspect of the actual anime, which I presume is going to stay.
That's what we hope. And obviously a lot of people are concerned because you are seeing this trend in anime as well, where because they're so bottlenecked, again, by the technology, they do then often end up relying on, for example, 3D animation suddenly popping up in a 2D animation. And a lot of people find that distracting and it's very noticeable. So hopefully this increase in like better tech will make the 2D aspect easier to deliver instead of just turning Japanese anime into 3D and more like Western animation.
So the irony here is you need the high tech in order to keep the low tech nature and feel of anime, as it were. Gunnar, I did want to ask you, because we have covered this general problem in Japan before, the fact that it is relatively low-tech in nature. Mm-hmm. It is something that the Japanese government has tackled. There's this infamous war on outdated technology by the digital minister of the government, and so on and so forth. I mean, is there resistance to this kind of stuff when you talk about the anime industry, but also in general? How does this fit into that broader war?
Yeah, absolutely. This problem is not specific to the animation industry. It really is something that Japan struggles with across the board, even as they try really, really hard to change it. I mean, the country's digital minister, Taro Kono, he back when he was chosen as the minister in 2021, he declared a war on outdated technology, because this is just a problem across the board. They were still using floppy disks across official government processes needed floppy disks. This is a technology from 1960s that everyone else stopped using latest 1990s, and this was still required, and no one was producing floppy disks since 2011. This was, completely untenable. They only got rid of that this year in July. That's how long it took. And
we did cover that on this show.
Exactly. And it was like a huge moment. We've declared victory in the war on floppy disks. Exactly. Pages only got phased out in 2019. Again, there was like no producers actually left using them, but a bunch of people, they were still needed for a bunch of processes. So this is a general problem in Japan, where even though they are such a high-tech country in many ways, they're still stuck using fax machines at businesses, floppy disks, pages, and 20-year-old outdated anime technology.
The war on anime and low-tech continues in Japan. Gunnar, thank you very much for joining us. That was Monocle's Gunnar Granlund. This is The Briefing. And finally, on today's show, some big news from the fashion industry, because the creative director, Hedi Slimane, is leaving Celine. And here to tell us more is Natalie Theodosi, Monocle's fashion director. She joins us from Paris. Natalie, what do we know about this surprising development?
Hi, Chris. I mean, it's crazy that just as Fashion Week was ending, Celine came out with this news, and it's been something that has been discussed, and then there's been a rumor that it may come for a while, and they just announced it a few hours ago, as Louis Vuitton ended Paris Fashion Week last night. It's big news, because Hedi Slimane really shaped the business. He completely transformed it. The revenues had tripled since he was there, and he also extended it to new categories like perfume, cosmetics. It will be interesting to see what they do next.
Well, that is the question, as always with these things, Natalie. Do we have any indications of who a successor might be? And also, in that context, perhaps, just tell us a little more about Celine. How important is Celine to the fashion industry?
In terms of what's happening next, I think no one knows, including the people inside the offices of Celine. There are rumor mills. I think being around the shows the past month, everyone has a theory and a potential scenario of who's going where. I mean, it's known that we call it designer musical chairs. There's a lot of changes happening across the market. But I really do think by making this kind of predictions, you're just adding to the noise, and we'll just have to wait and see what happens. What's interesting with Celine in particular is Hedi Slimane had defined every single aspect of the brand, and then he had creative control across the board, from the logo to the stores. He was shooting the campaigns himself as well as designing the collection. So whoever comes in will have to have this kind of holistic approach, and it's a big job to fill. So it might take some time, and we might see a few collections produced by the studio until the right person comes along. And yeah, in terms of Celine as a brand in general, it's very important, and it has its roots in Paris. And what Hedi had done is really highlight that history, especially in the last few collections, and then really establish it as a French Parisian house. And this is what LVMH said when they were thanking him in the exit announcement.
Just finally, Natalie, I mean, you've been at Paris Fashion Week for the last week or so. With this news coming at the end, the fact that you were talking there about this kind of musical chairs that is happening in the industry, even though somebody like Hedi Slimane is so important and is Celine at this point, why do you think this musical chairs is happening, considering that all of these creative directors really kind of own the brands that they're directing?
It's a very good question and a very timely topic. I think given the pace of the industry, even jobs as important and as desirable as being a creative director in a big heritage brand, a lot of designers are no longer able to do it for long, and kind of go in, cannot take the pressure, to be frank, and then you've got these early exits. Well, in the past, someone would go into a house like Karl Lagerfeld did and then stay there for decades. But it is interesting, and I think that there is a shift happening. What you said is, in many cases, that the star is the creative director rather than the brand, but now we are seeing a change, and it is a lot more important to focus on the brand, its history, its codes, and the role of the creative director or the designer leading the studio is changing a little bit, and is becoming, it's not about just them and their vision, but about putting the brand forward to achieve longevity and to avoid this constant change when someone comes in and then exits.
Just finally then, I mean, Slimane, do we have any idea what he might be doing next?
I wish I could tell you, but there is, whatever we say would only be rumors and kind of predictions without any substantial sources behind him. He also notoriously never speaks to press ever, so we will have to wait and see. I'm sure he will be doing something even bigger.
Watch this space. That was Natalie Theodosi, Monocle's fashion director, joining us from Paris. And that is all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Anita Riota. Our researchers were Gunnar Grunlid and Sana Jumani, and our studio manager was Steph Chungu. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.